Okay, well, we're so happy to have Deirdre McCloskey here, the eminent economic historian, on the occasion of the publication of the third volume of her trilogy on the bourgeois
Praise
virtues,
the Lord!
bourgeois equality. We're going to just talk very briefly here and talk about the book. My first question, what do people commonly misunderstand about capitalism and the past 200 years of economic history?
Well, it's in the very word. Both the left and the right think that capitalism has to do mainly with the accumulation of capital. So piling brick on brick and bachelor's degree on bachelor's degree. And it's true that that's a feature of the last 200 years. Unfortunately, it's also a feature of the last 200,000 years. Humans have always accumulated. There's not anything strange about the rate or amount of accumulation in the last 200 years. What's bizarre is the amount of innovation, the amount of what I call market-tested betterment. And that's just exploded. As Matt Ridley says, ideas started having sex, and the baby ideas had sex, and the grandbaby ideas had sex, and just more and more. And then that made the capital investment worth doing. So capital in capitalism is just the intermediary. It's not the real cause. The real cause is technical and some institutional change. And that in turn was caused by the notions of equality in what used to be called liberalism. Free people equal before the law and equal in social standing.
What about the role of institutions?
Well, as I said, institutions like capital are mostly intermediate causes. Institutions change largely in response to good ideas. You develop the telegraph, and that makes centralized stock exchanges sensible, and the smaller regional stock exchanges get less important. So it's the innovation, it's the telegraph that determines the institution, usually not the other way around. Now, there are institutions in the modern world that were new ideas and important. For example, the idea of the research university embodied in the University of Berlin in 1810. But mainly it was an ethical and ideological change that made the institutions possible. The institution of a free press only came in fact came about as a result of the invention of the steam press, the circular press, which could produce tremendous numbers of copies, and that made advertising the main support of the newspapers, whereas in the 18th century, the main support was political parties, including the government itself. So there was not a free and independent press in the 18th century as there came to be. So the institution of the free press needed the First Amendment in the United States, and that's an institution, but mostly it was intermediate in the same way that capital is. You got to have the capital, you got to have the bricks to make the building. But if all you had was the bricks or the institutions, you would run into very sharply diminishing returns. It's innovation, ideas, that's what made the modern world.
So it seems as if innovation and ideas could happen anywhere at any time. Why do you think that this happened where it did and when it did?
That's crucial. If you were in 1600 going to make a bet about where an industrial revolution, or what's more important, a great enrichment of the 19th and 20th century was going to happen, you would have bet on China if you could have imagined such an amazing series of events. Because China in 1600 had by far the most advanced capitalist economy in the world. It had the most important technologies. It invented most things. China. So why this funny little corner of northwestern Europe? Why was it the first? Well, I believe it was the first because of the idea of equality before the law and equality of social standing. It's not what I call French equality in honor of Rousseau. It's not outcome equality, which is the way we usually think about equality. No. It's equality of opportunity, and the idea, as the English say, that everyone can have a go. Have a go, it's an English expression. And it's hard to convey how unable to have a go people were in earlier times. You were a woman, you were a serf, you were placed in the great chain of being, as it was called, and you were not allowed to have a go. You, in fact, indeed, the bourgeoisie itself had guilds and protections of various sort to prevent people from enterprising.
What role do you think the Protestant Reformation played in all this?
Well, the old story is that of the great Max Weber, an economist and sociologist, in his marvelous book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, 1905, which is that it was the doctrine of salvation that made Calvinists anxious and made them more enterprising than Catholics. But that's been proven wrong over and over again. The economics is wrong, the theology is wrong, the history is wrong. Uncle Max got it wrong. But yet, another feature of the Protestant Reformation I think was very important, which was the change in church governance. And this is expressed among the Puritans, the so-called Congregationalists of England and Holland and parts of Germany and Massachusetts, who chose their own ministers, you see. It wasn't some hierarchy telling them. They chose their own ministers. And then the more extreme example of this in the 16th century is the Anabaptists, who had hardly any ministers at all. They would have spiritually excited people who might lead the congregation. And then in the 17th century, the English Quakers, who really had no one in charge. To this day, the Society of Friends simply gets together and sits in a circle and waits until the Holy Spirit descends. So it was church governance that made people think that they could do it themselves. They didn't need to have kings and hierarchies. And this kept being reinforced by various other, we have the Reformation, we have reading, which was very important to making the Reformation work. We have the revolt, the Dutch revolt against Spain in the late 16th century that extended into the 17th. We have the various revolutions in England, the English Civil War, the 1640s, which gave birth to remarkably egalitarian ideas that people are people and you should leave them alone and they shouldn't be instructed and bossed around, which was an extremely radical idea in the 17th century. Then in the 18th, and then the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which I think is overemphasized sometimes, and then the American Revolution and the French. All those R's, I call them the 4 R's, resulted in a revaluation of the bourgeoisie. It's not so much that the internal psychology of inventors and merchants changed. That was pretty much the same as it always had been. But what did change is the attitude of the rest of the society. People were willing to give merchants and inventors rope to hang themselves or to help the society as a whole. So I call it the bourgeois deal. You let me, a bourgeois, open a new hairdressing salon, and in the long run, I'll make you rich.
And you're saying that Catholics like me who have enjoyed the Great Enrichment therefore should feel somewhat happy about the Protestant Reformation.
Well, the fact is, and this was one of the many criticisms of Max Weber, is that many of the entrepreneurs of the 16th and 17th century were Catholic. For example, in Amsterdam, in Holland, the Catholics fleeing from Antwerp were 1/3 of the entrepreneurs of Amsterdam. In the south of France, there were many Protestant entrepreneurs and many Catholic entrepreneurs. So his whole idea, which, is a little unsurprising in Max Weber, a North German Protestant, viewing with disdain South Germans, Catholics like Bavarians. It's a little bit unsurprising that he came up with this heroic story about the Protestants. But it's not it's not their doctrines, it's their church organization that really showed people that they could do it themselves.
There are many gifts of the Spirit.
There are many gifts of the Spirit, but the greatest of these is love.
Let's change gears for a minute and talk about income inequality.
Yeah.
Your view is that as long as the condition of the working class is improving, we shouldn't care so much about income inequality.
Yes. Equality is not a coherent ethical program. What? We're all to be the same height. We're all to be the same weight. We're all to be the same IQ. If you're smarter than me, as I think you are, we're to pound nails into your head to make you stupider so that you'll be equal to me.
There are people who would like to do that.
I know. I'm sure. Well, I don't know. I'm surprised to hear that. But so equality is a silly program. It doesn't have any ethical sense to it. Whereas raising up the poorest in our society, which should be the conservative and libertarian goal, that works. That's something that you can express in public policy and can make work. It doesn't involve foolish things like increasing the minimum wage to $15 an hour. It involves freeing up the economy. And so that's where it came from. It came from this amazing modern enrichment, from an average in the world of, in modern terms, $3 a day consumed and earned, to, in, say, the United States, now $130 a day. That's the magnitude we're talking about. A factor of 30, a factor of 100 in some cases. That's what we need to explain, and that's not to be explained by capital or institutions or trade unions or government. It's explained by human ingenuity unleashed.
Are you concerned at all if the gap between the rich and the poor gets large enough, even if the material conditions of the working class are improving, that in some way makes the working class distrustful of the system, less apt to take risks?
The problem is that we mustn't encourage envy, because envy is insatiable. Shakespeare's famous sonnet on this, he says, in effect, when I think of how much brighter this man is, or how his face is more handsome than mine, that sonnet embodies envy as a nasty and stupid way of going about life. So we've got to work against envy. But here's an important economic fact. Real equality of real comfort has increased in the last 40 years, and certainly in the last 100. If you focus on wealth, monetary wealth especially, equality has moved up and down, and in 3 countries, Thomas Piketty found that inequality has increased in the last 30 years, and those were Britain, the United States, and Canada. Not his own country of France, and most of the other countries he studied. It didn't increase, contrary to what people think he said. He's worried about the future. He says, oh, it's going to get worse, the sky is going to fall. not that it already has fallen. So even if you study wealth, you find that it's not in all countries, it's inequality is increased. But the equality of real comfort, of proper or helpful medical care, of having a roof over your head, of having enough to eat, of having adequate schools, these have gotten better in the last 30 years, not worse. This is true in Britain, it's true in the United States, it's true in these countries where the wealth inequality may have increased. So I think it's grossly it's ethically incoherent, it encourages envy, and in factual terms, it's overblown.
Let's switch gears and let me ask you a question about yourself.
Indeed, please.
I believe it's the case, and correct me if I'm wrong, you describe yourself as, quote, a postmodern, free market, quantitative, Episcopalian, feminist, Aristotelian.
Yes, I do.
Would you mind elaborating on that?
Well, they're all supposed to be counter to each other, but I'm all of those and more. I think human beings are much more complicated than can be put on a simple scale from left to right. And that's certainly true of my politics and my scientific opinions and my scientific methodology. For instance, I believe that to do economics correctly, you have to have the math and the statistics and economic theory. You've got to be thinking in these terms. But then you've also got to have experience of the world, which can be acquired by studying Ibsen's plays or Mann's novels, as much as it can be by studying studying the numbers. So the alleged contrast between the sciences on the one hand and the humanities on the other, I think is foolish. I think with Jonathan Haidt, for example, the social psychologist, who I think agrees with me, I think that if you make more progress if you walk on both feet instead of hopping along on one. So I don't regard these as contradictory. I'm a Christian libertarian. People say, "Oh, you've got to be an atheist if you're a libertarian." Well, who says? I'm an Episcopalian if you call that a Christian.
Well, I think we will.
Thank you. You're very kind.
My last question. What can we do? So we know that the last 200 years have brought about the Great Enrichment, and that's been a marvelous thing for human welfare.
Astonishing.
What can we do to ensure the next 200 are just as good?
Well, one thing we can't do is have industrial policy or any of the or a minimum wage or any of the various abominations that our friends on the left propose. Planning, government subsidies for windmills and so forth are simply a terrible idea. I don't think, though, that the government can stop this. Now, that's a kind of an optimistic view, because in 1914, government actions, war in particular, stopped human progress, or very significantly slowed it down. And that could happen again, but I don't think so. I think the demonstration effect of countries like China and India, which are pulling themselves at a tremendously fast rate out of poverty, and countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Botswana in Africa that have succeeded in pulling themselves out of poverty through liberal policies in the old sense, not in the modern American sense. That is, letting people have a go. Think of it this way. The social scientific fashions and discoveries of the 19th century in Europe, nationalism, socialism. If you like that, you might want to try National Socialism, see if you like that, and eugenics, geographical geographic determinism, theorized imperialism, all sorts of terrible ideas were all wrong, mistakes, a disaster. But one thing was proven in the 19th century. It was an 18th century idea. It was Voltaire's idea and Tom Paine's idea and Mary Wollstonecraft's idea that if you leave people alone, they're immensely creative. And that was shown to be true in the 19th century and still more in parts of the 20th. So I'm very optimistic about the future. I don't join my friends Bob Gordon and Tyler Cohen in thinking, oh, the sky's falling, oh, things are going to get worse, oh, there are headwinds. I think that's nonsense. I think we're in for a amazing century in which all the world's people become as rich and have as many opportunities as Americans or French people do.
I hope you're right, and we'll leave it there. Thank you again so much.
Thank you, dear.